The morning Garrett Hale fixed Eleanor Marsh's transmission, nobody asked him to. Eleanor was 72 and had been driving the same 2003 Buick LeSabre since her husband passed, and the transmission had been slipping for 6 weeks, long enough that she'd started timing her grocery runs around the hill on Denison Street, taking the long way to avoid the grade entirely. She'd mentioned it once to Garrett in passing, the way neighbors mention things not as a request, just as the small weight of a problem spoken aloud so it doesn't have to be carried alone. Garrett had gotten up at 4:30 that Tuesday, same as always, made coffee in the dark, while Seattle's October rain came down hard against the kitchen window, and driven to Kowalski's before 6. He'd pulled Eleanor's Buick around back with the spare key she kept under the ceramic frog by her front steps, diagnosed the solenoid pack in 40 minutes, and had the car back in her driveway before she woke up. He left a sticky note on the windshield. Done. Don't take Denison fast for a week. G. No invoice, no mention of it later. Wren had watched the whole thing from the garage doorway in her pajamas and rain boots, eating a piece of toast, her dark hair sticking up on one side from sleep. She was 7 and had developed the habit of appearing wherever Garrett was in the morning, not because she needed supervision, but because she simply preferred his company to being alone in the house. He'd stopped being surprised by this about a year ago and had started leaving a second mug on the workbench with 2 inches of warm cocoa in it. She took a long look at Eleanor's driveway, then at her father's hands already stained with transmission fluid at 6:15 in the morning, and asked the question in that direct, unhurried way. She had no preamble, no softening. "Dad, why do you fix things that other people broke?" Garrett wiped his hands on a shop rag and didn't answer right away. Not because he didn't have one, but because the answer he had felt too large for a Tuesday morning on the wet driveway. He handed her the cocoa mug. She took it with both hands. "Finish getting ready," he said. 20 minutes. She accepted this the way she accepted most of his non-answers, not as a deflection, but as evidence that the question deserved more thought than the moment allowed. She went back inside. Garrett stood in the gray light for a moment longer, listening to the rain thin out against the gutters, and did not think about Claire. Or tried not to. The trying was its own kind of thinking. The drive to Wren's school took 11 minutes if he hit the lights on Mercer right. He never did. 14 minutes was the honest average, and Garrett had stopped lying to himself about small things years ago. It was one of the few disciplines the last 4 years had forced on him, the inability to maintain comfortable fictions about time, money, capacity, love. You learn what you're actually made of when you're the only person standing between a 7-year-old and the world. There's no partner to absorb the gap between who you thought you were and who the situation requires. On the dashboard of his truck, wedged into the corner where the defroster vent met the black plastic panel, was a woman's watch. Small face brown leather strap gone soft with age, the crystal scratched in one diagonal line across the 4. He'd found it in the glove compartment 4 months after the accident, tucked inside the manual he'd never read, and he'd moved it to the dashboard that same afternoon without examining why. It had been there since. He never wore it. Never put it away. Wren got out of the truck in front of Jefferson Elementary without ceremony, swinging her backpack over one shoulder. Then she stopped, turned back and said through the open window, "You should answer the question today." Not a demand, just an observation, the way she stated most things. She was gone before he could respond. Garrett sat in the drop-off lane until the car behind him tapped its horn. Kowalski's Auto and Repair sat on a wedge-shaped lot at the corner of 15th and Brannigan in Seattle's Central District, a neighborhood that had been blue-collar for 50 years and was slowly becoming something else, the way all useful things eventually get renovated into something decorative. The garage had 3 bays, a waiting room with 4 plastic chairs, and a 12-year-old coffee maker, and a wall-mounted phone that Ray Kowalski refused to replace on philosophical grounds he'd never fully articulated. Ray was 63 and built like a man who'd been doing physical work since before Garrett was born, which was accurate. He'd opened the garage in 1991 with money borrowed from his father-in-law and had paid it back in 18 months. His wife had died of breast cancer in 2014. He didn't talk about it often, but had a particular way of going quiet when the subject of grief came up in conversation, not uncomfortable, just attentive, as though storing it somewhere careful. He'd hired Garrett 4 years ago, 2 weeks after Claire's funeral, when Garrett had walked in off the street with grease already under his nails from fixing a neighbor's lawnmower, and said he needed something that used his hands and paid on Friday. Ray had looked at him for a long moment at the particular quality of stillness that grief gives a person, that too controlled posture, the eyes slightly too present, overcompensating, and said, 8 an hour to start. More when you stop trying so hard not to fall apart. Garrett had worked there since. Dex Morrow was 26 and had the energy of someone who hadn't yet learned that not every problem required full-speed engagement. He was good with his hands, better with customers, and had a specific talent for diffusing difficult people, not through charm exactly, but through an earnest interest in whatever they were upset about that was so genuine it tended to short-circuit aggravation entirely. He'd been at Kowalski's for 2 years and had decided Garrett was his best friend, a decision Garrett had never explicitly agreed to and had quietly stopped arguing against. That Tuesday afternoon, Dex leaned against Bay 2's doorframe while Garrett worked under a lifted Subaru Forester and said, "You need to get out this week. I'm not asking. You're always asking. I'm telling. There's a difference." Dex folded his arms. "Marcus from the Bar League knows a place downtown. Ember and Oak. Not a dive. Good beer, no karaoke." "I'm not interested in good beer and no karaoke. Your daughter told me, and I quote, that her dad needs to go somewhere that isn't work or the grocery store." Garrett was quiet under the Subaru for a moment. "You talked to my 7-year-old about my social life. She brought it up. Of course she did." He went in the end, which both of them knew he would when he agreed to the argument. He changed into a clean flannel, left the oil-stained Carhartts in the truck bed, and drove downtown through rain that had eased to a drizzle by 8 o'clock, the kind that doesn't bother you but doesn't let you forget it's there. Ember and Oak occupied the corner of 5th and Lenora in Seattle's Belltown, all exposed steel and warm light, the kind of place that had spent considerable money making itself look like it hadn't spent considerable money. The bar top was wide and dark-grained, the bottles backlit in amber. It was a Tuesday, and moderately full, the specific Tuesday night crowd of people who had reasons to be somewhere other than home on a weeknight, which meant a cross-section of the quietly restless and the professionally obligated. Garrett found a stool at the far end of the bar, ordered whatever was on tap that was local, and let the noise of the room settle around him. He didn't know why certain public spaces were restful to him. Now he'd been solitary before Claire died, more comfortable with silence than most people. But grief had added a specific dimension to that preference. Crowds were easier than one-on-one. In a crowd, nobody expected sustained attention. The amber ale arrived. He wrapped both hands around it and took a long pull, clean and cold, and let his shoulders drop for the first time since the Subaru. That was when he heard the name. He wasn't listening, wasn't trying to. The corner booth carried sound in a particular way against the low ceiling, and the man doing most of the talking had the volume of someone accustomed to rooms going quiet when he spoke. Derek Aldridge was 37, square-jawed, with the groomed tan of someone who treated tropical vacations as professional maintenance. He'd been holding court for the better part of an hour by the looks of it. Champagne bucket on the table, 4 other men leaning in with the body language of people who'd stopped having independent opinions about an hour ago. "Harlow River is going to be the signature development of the decade," Derek was saying loud enough to be performing rather than conversing. 22 floors, river views, mixed-use retail at the base. We break ground in 8 weeks. Garrett's hands didn't move. He kept his eyes on the bar top. Harlow River. East Bank, the industrial stretch below the East Side Rail Corridor. He knew that land. Hadn't thought about it in years, but the memory was the kind that didn't require effort to retrieve, the kind that sticks because of what you found, not what you were looking for. 9 years ago, fresh out of Morrison and Webb's structural division, he'd done preliminary site analysis on that corridor for a different developer who'd ultimately passed. The contamination data had been straightforward enough: a dry cleaning facility that operated through 1997 PERC solvent seeping into the water table, a cleanup order issued by the state follow-up remediation that stalled after a partial effort and a change of property ownership. The kind of paperwork trail that looks resolved if you read the summary and doesn't look resolved at all if you read the appendices. He'd never gone back. The developer walked. Life moved. He'd been fired from Morrison & Webb 3 months later, officially restructuring actually, because he'd refused to sign off on a load calculation Derek Aldridge had pushed through on a different project, and Morrison & Webb had decided Derek Aldridge's relationship with their largest client was more valuable than Garrett's objection. He'd known then that the objection was right. He'd also known that being right and being heard were different categories. That had been the year before Claire, before everything that came after. He sat with his beer and said nothing. At some point he was halfway through his second and the corner booth had gotten louder. One of Derek's associates peeled off and walked toward him. Young slicked back the particular swagger of someone auditioning for a version of Derek he hadn't grown into yet. "Hey man, we were wondering if you just got off work." Garrett looked down at himself. Flannel clean jeans, boots. He'd changed. There was still a faint line of oil under his left thumbnail that hadn't come out. "Yeah," he said. "I did." "Mechanic, that's awesome. Real salt-of-the-earth stuff." The condescension was structural, built into the architecture of the sentence, rather than the tone, which almost made it worse. "We're in commercial real estate, development acquisitions, big projects, high stakes." He gestured back at Derek's booth with the neck of his beer. "Probably a different world." Probably. The associate returned to his audience with the look of someone who'd confirmed what he came to confirm. Derek raised his glass slightly in Garrett's direction without looking over a gesture that managed to acknowledge and dismiss simultaneously. Garrett looked at the amber in his glass and said nothing. His jaw was tight. His pulse was steady. He sat for another 30 minutes because leaving earlier would have felt like the wrong kind of retreat. That was when she sat down. She didn't choose the stool beside him. There were 3 empty ones between them, and she took the one that left 2. Not adjacent, not distant. She ordered a glass of Malbec without looking at the menu, and when it came she turned the glass by the stem once before drinking. She had dark hair pulled back, a charcoal blazer over a white shirt, a slim watch on her left wrist that she'd checked twice before the wine arrived. She carried the particular stillness of someone who was at rest with being observed and neither invited nor required it. She wasn't part of Derek's group. Garrett had noticed her earlier at a table near the window, 2 men who looked like contractors' documents between them. The contractors had left 20 minutes ago. She spoke without turning her head fully toward him, looking forward at the bar. "You knew something just now. When he said the project name, I saw your face change." "I fix engines," Garrett said. "That's not an answer to what I said." He looked at her then. She was looking at the bar too, glass in hand, not pressing. The lack of pressure was itself a kind of pressure. "I don't build buildings anymore," he said. "But you did." Still not a question. He looked back at his beer. "Long time ago." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'm Vivian Cross." She didn't extend a hand. Just the name flat, like she was used to it landing differently than it did in rooms like this. "Garrett. Just Garrett. Hale." She nodded once as though filing it. "Those men in the corner booth are celebrating a deal I haven't approved yet." She said it without heat, purely informational. "The one doing most of the talking is my director of acquisitions." Garrett looked at the corner booth, then back at her. "Your partner." "My employee." The distinction was quiet but deliberate, which is a different kind of complicated. He finished his beer. She finished about a third of her wine. Around them the bar moved through its Tuesday rhythms, conversation at normal volume, the clink of glass, someone's phone vibrating on the bar top, 3 stools down. "What was it?" Vivian asked. "What was what?" "The thing you knew. When he said Harlow River." Garrett set the empty glass down carefully. "The land has a history that doesn't show up in summary reports." She turned toward him then fully for the first time. "What kind of history?" "The kind that creates liability." He picked up his jacket. "I'm not in that business anymore." She took a business card from the inside pocket of her blazer and placed it on the bar top. Not handed to him, placed. Then she turned back to her wine. He looked at the card. Standard stock clean sans serif Vivian Cross CEO Hartwell Development Group. On the back in handwriting that was precise and slightly impatient. 4 words, if it matters, call. He left the card on the bar, walked out into the drizzle, got to his truck, sat for a moment in the dark with the rain on the windshield, and then went back inside and took it. He told himself on the drive home that he was keeping the card for no particular reason. This was the first comfortable fiction he'd attempted in 4 years, and it lasted approximately 11 minutes before he stopped pretending. Wren was asleep when he got home, her stuffed rabbit crushed under one arm, her reading light still on. He turned it off, stood in her doorway for a moment in the dark. The apartment was a 2-bedroom on Boylston 3rd floor, with a view of the building next door, and if you stood at a specific angle in the kitchen, a sliver of the Space Needle's base. It was the place he'd found the month after Claire's funeral, when the house they'd shared in Madrona became something he couldn't stay in anymore, not because of the memories, but because of the specific quality of the silence, which was Claire's absence in room-temperature 3-dimensional detail. He made a cup of coffee he didn't need and sat down at the kitchen table with his laptop. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. The city's public records portal loaded slowly the way government websites always do, designed by the lowest bidder in a year when the expectations were different. He typed in Harlow River Corridor, then Environmental Assessment, King County Industrial Remediation, 1994 to 2002. What came back was not surprising. It was worse than he remembered. The dry cleaning facility had operated under 3 different names between 1987 and 1997, a chain of ownership transfers that had the fingerprints of liability shifting on them, each new owner inheriting the contamination and the plausible claim that the previous owner had created it. The 1997 cleanup order had specified 3 phases. Phase 1 had been completed, Phase 2 had begun and then stalled when the property changed hands in 2001. Phase 3, the deep remediation. The water table work had never started. The 2001 transfer documentation listed the contamination disclosure as pending assessment, which in Garrett's experience meant someone had decided the liability was the next owner's problem. He cross-referenced the structural permit database. Harlow River Complex, 22 floors mixed-use residential and retail permit application submitted 8 weeks ago by Hartwell Development Group Derek Aldridge, listed as project lead. The structural drawings were attached as a public filing. He opened them. He was not a structural engineer by training. His background was urban planning and site analysis, the work of understanding what a place was before deciding what it should become. But he'd spent enough years at Morrison and Webb adjacent to structural work that he could read a set of drawings with functional competence. He went through the foundation specifications first, then the load distribution diagrams, and felt something go cold and specific in his chest around the 3rd page. The load-bearing calculation for floors 3 through 7 used a soil-bearing capacity of 2,200 pounds per square foot. He pulled up the 1999 soil survey that was buried in the environmental file, the one from before the stalled Phase 2 remediation. The actual bearing capacity of the substrate at that depth in the northeast quadrant of the lot where the building's primary load column was positioned was closer to 1,400. The discrepancy wasn't in the margin of acceptable variance. It was structural. Over time, not immediately, not visibly, but over time, over load cycles, over the microseismic activity that was Seattle's permanent background condition, the settlement would be uneven. The building wouldn't fall. It would tilt almost imperceptibly along the northeast axis. The tiling would stress the connections between floors 3 and 7. The connections would develop microfractures. The microfractures would go undetected because they'd be inside the concrete, invisible to standard inspection, until the settlement hit a threshold that triggered something faster. He sat back from the laptop. The coffee had gone cold. This was not a financial problem. This was not a regulatory problem. 22 floors of residential units, mixed-use retail on the ground level. People who would sign leases and move furniture and put children's beds against walls in the northeast quadrant and never know. He thought about Wren's question from that morning, still unanswered. He looked at Vivian Cross's card on the table beside the laptop. It was 1 in the morning. He went to bed. He did not sleep for a long time. Wren found him at this kitchen table at 6 with 2 browser tabs still open, the coffee maker already cycling through its second pot. She surveyed the scene with the careful neutrality of someone who had learned when to ask and when to let things come on their own timeline. She poured herself orange juice, sat across from him, and looked at the screen he hadn't bothered to angle away. She couldn't read the technical specifications, but she could see the render image, the tower, the glass facade, the river gleaming behind it in the marketing photograph. "Is that building going to be safe, Dad?" He looked at her. "I don't know yet." "Then you should find out before someone moves in." She took a drink of her juice. "That seems like the obvious thing." It was. It was the most obvious thing in the world, and he'd spent 8 hours building an argument against it. He looked at the dashboard of the truck when he dropped her at school, the watch in its corner. Claire had been direct in the way Wren was direct, not unkind, not blunt, just unable to see the point in dressing up what was true. He'd loved that about her. He'd also been afraid of it sometimes, in the way you're afraid of things that hold you to a standard you're not sure you can meet. He got back to the apartment, took Vivian Cross's card from the table, stood at the window looking at the sliver of Seattle he could see from the kitchen, the wet rooftops, the gray October sky doing its thing. He called the number. She picked up on the second ring. He didn't introduce himself. "The building your company is celebrating, the structure is wrong. People will be living in something that will fail them." A silence. Not the silence of surprise. The silence of someone recalibrating around information that confirmed a fear they'd been carrying. "Where can we meet?" Not a question. A next step. "Your office," he said. "Today, if you can. Bring whatever structural documentation you have." Another pause, shorter. 11 o'clock. He said yes, and hung up before he could think about it more carefully, which was the only way he'd learned to make the calls that mattered. Think first, decide, then stop thinking until after. The Hartwell Development Group occupied the 31st floor of a glass tower in downtown Seattle's financial district, a building Garrett had walked past dozens of times without registering. The lobby had the particular quality of spaces designed to communicate that your time here is a privilege. High ceilings, deliberate acoustics, the kind of front desk staffed by people whose friendliness was calibrated to the visitor's apparent access level. The man at the desk looked at Garrett's flannel and boots and asked twice whether he had an appointment. He did. The elevator opened onto a reception area that gave way to a corner office which was designed, he understood immediately, walking in, to remind people that they occupied a different altitude than Vivian Cross. Floor-to-ceiling windows, the harbor below the city laid out like a planning document. Minimalist furniture, deliberate angles. The room was a position statement. What it didn't account for was the small framed photograph on the corner of the desk. An older man in a hard hat on a construction site laughing at something off camera. The frame was simple, the kind you buy because the photo matters, not because you want the frame to matter. It was the only personal object in the room, and it told him more about her than the windows did. Vivian Cross came in 2 minutes after the assistant left. She was in a different blazer than the night before, charcoal again, her hair up. She shook his hand once firmly and sat without ceremony. She placed a folder on the desk between them. "These are the structural documents we have on file. Derek's team managed the permit process." Garrett opened the folder. He'd seen the public filing, but this was the internal version, the version with the annotations, the revision history, the sign-off chain. He worked through it in silence while she waited, which she was good at. The patience of someone who'd learned that interrupting a process doesn't shorten it. He found it on page 14. The internal version had a different load calculation on the foundation specification than the public filing. The public filing, the one submitted to the city, the one that had generated the permit, showed the soil-bearing capacity at 2,200. The internal version, the one in his hands right now, the one that was presumably the source document from which the permit application had been generated, showed 1,400. Correct. The discrepancy ran through 3 pages of supporting calculations. Someone had changed the numbers between the internal document and the city filing. He turned to page 14 and set it flat on the desk between them. He placed his finger on the bearing capacity figure. Then he opened his own phone, pulled up the public record, and placed it beside the document. She leaned forward, looked at the 2 figures, looked at him. The silence that followed was not the silence of someone who didn't understand. It was the silence of someone who understood completely and was deciding what to do with that understanding. "Derek submitted the permit application," she said. "Yes. He would have been working from this document. That's what the revision date says." She turned back to page 14. Her finger moved to the sign-off line at the bottom of the page, the internal approval before the public filing. The signature there was not Derek's. It was a signature Garrett didn't recognize, initials and a date. Then she turned to the last page of the section. The amended page, the one that matched the public filing. A different signature. Larger, more deliberate. Derek Aldridge. Dated 6 days after the original internal sign-off. Vivian's hand was perfectly still on the page. Then she turned to the front of the folder, to the cover sheet where the project summary listed the initial internal approval structure. Her father's name was there, Franklin Cross, founder and chairman, as the senior approving authority for projects above $200 million. His signature was on the cover sheet, dated 4 months ago, before his illness had accelerated, before he died. The version of the document her father had approved had the correct numbers. The version submitted to the city, signed by Derek Aldridge 6 days after her father's approval, did not. Garrett watched her arrive at this understanding in real time. He didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that the documents weren't already saying. She set the folder closed carefully, the way you put down something that might break. The city below them continued its Tuesday unconcerned. Her hands were still on the cover of the folder and the knuckles were white. "I need to verify this against city records before I do anything," she said. Her voice was level in the way that requires effort. "I can pull the full public record tonight. Environmental history, the 1997 remediation file, all of it. There's more than just the structural issue." He stood, picking up his jacket. "The contamination cleanup was never completed. The load calculation is a separate problem from the contamination. You have 2 distinct issues, either of which ends the project. Together there's something else." She looked up at him from behind the desk. The composed exterior was intact, but he could see the line where it was working to stay that way. The photograph of her father in the hard hat was visible over her left shoulder. "Who else knows about the load calculation discrepancy?" "Nobody that I'm aware of." "Keep it that way until I say otherwise." Not a request. Not aggressive, just the reflex of someone who'd learned that information released at the wrong moment becomes a different kind of damage. "I need time to understand what Derek's role in this actually is before this goes anywhere official." Garrett put on his jacket. He paused at the door. "The permit application is public record. Anybody who reads it against your internal document would see what I saw. That's not a window that stays open forever." He looked back at her. "People sign leases in buildings before the drywall is dry." She held his eyes. "I understand what you're telling me." He left the folder on her desk and walked back to the elevator. The city was still there through the windows, gray and wet and going about its business. Somewhere below, on the east bank of the river, a plot of contaminated ground was waiting for a foundation that would not hold. In the lobby, the front desk attendant watched him walk back through the marble atrium with a different expression than the one he'd worn 40 minutes ago. Garrett didn't notice. He was thinking about the differential between what a city files and what a city knows, between what a building shows from the outside and what it's doing in its bones. He was thinking about what Wren had said, the uncomplicated certainty of it. Then you should find out before someone moves in. He pushed through the glass doors into the Seattle drizzle and pulled out his phone. He had 9 hours before he needed to pick Wren up from school. He was going to need most of them. The 9 hours were not enough. Garrett worked through them anyway, starting at the kitchen table with the city's public records portal and expanding outward. The way site analysis always had to expand. Not from what you were looking for, but from what was adjacent to it. The documents that didn't announce their importance. The footnotes in remediation files that referenced other remediation files. The ownership transfer records that told a story only when you read them in sequence rather than isolation. By 4 in the afternoon, he had 11 browser tabs open and 3 pages of handwritten notes in the small spiral notebook he kept in his jacket pocket, the one he'd originally bought for Wren's school schedule and had gradually colonized with other things. The contamination picture was worse in detail than in summary. The dry cleaning facility had used PERC at industrial volumes through its entire operating life, the kind of usage that saturated soil at depth rather than sitting near the surface where remediation was straightforward. The 1997 cleanup order had been specific 3 phases, third phase to include deep bore sampling and water table treatment at minimum 4 monitoring points in the northeast quadrant. Phase 1 and partial Phase 2 were documented. Phase 3 existed only as a line item in a 2001 transfer document marked Deferred Pending New Ownership Assessment, which was the bureaucratic equivalent of leaving a loaded problem on someone else's doorstep with a note that said, "Good luck." The current owner of record before the Hartwell acquisition was a holding company registered in Delaware, which told him nothing except that someone had wanted the ownership layer to be opaque. The Hartwell purchase had closed 7 months ago, 2 months before Franklin Cross died. He found the environmental disclosure in the acquisition file, 2 pages a checkbox marked Satisfactory, No Supporting Documentation Referenced. The kind of disclosure that meant someone had decided the liability was manageable or the deal was too attractive to let liability complicate. He picked Wren up at 3:15. She ate a snack in the truck on the way home and told him about a disagreement she'd had with a classmate over the correct method for timing a science experiment, her account so precise in its reasoning and so genuinely puzzled by the other child's position that Garrett had to work to keep his expression neutral. She was not asking for his opinion on who was right. She was processing aloud, which was a thing she did, and which he'd learned to receive as a kind of companionship rather than a request. At home, she settled at the kitchen table with her homework while he made dinner, and at some point, without planning to, he told her he might be getting some extra work. Consulting work. For a company downtown. She looked up from her worksheet. "Is it about the building?" He said yes. She returned to the worksheet. "Good," she said, and underlined something with her yellow pencil. Subject closed in her estimation. He called Vivian at 8 after Wren was in bed. She picked up on the first ring. "The contamination cleanup was never completed," he said. Phase 3 of the 1997 remediation order, water table treatment, deep bore sampling in the northeast quadrant, was deferred in a 2001 ownership transfer and never reinstated. The acquisition disclosure in your file has no supporting environmental assessment. Somebody checked a box without the documentation to back it. The pause on her end was measured. Derek handled the acquisition due diligence. "I know. How long would a proper Phase 3 remediation take?" 14 to 18 months minimum. Cost would run 8 figures before you put a shovel in the ground for anything else. He looked at his notes. The structural issue and the contamination issue are independent. You don't have to solve both to stop the project, but both exist. Another pause. "I'm going to need you formally. Not officially, not yet, but I need you accessible and I need your documentation in order." Her voice had the particular quality of someone building a plan in real time, trimming as they went. "Can you come to the office Thursday morning early, before Derek's team arrives?" 7 works. 7 works. A beat. "Garrett, don't talk to anyone about the load calculation discrepancy. Not yet. Not even Ray." He understood why she was asking. He also understood that the ask revealed something about where she thought the leak risk was, which was inside her own building. "All right," he said. After he hung up, he sat at the table for a while in the kitchen, quiet, the notebook open in front of him, and thought about the photograph on her desk. The man in the hard hat laughing at something off camera. The particular ease of someone caught being happy without knowing anyone was watching. Thursday morning arrived with the specific gray clarity of a Seattle October day that had decided not to rain but hadn't committed to anything better. Garrett left Kowalski's at 6:45, telling Ray he had an early appointment, which was true, and also the entirety of what he intended to say. Ray looked at him over the hood of a Honda Civic he was diagnosing and said nothing, which was Ray's way of indicating that he'd noticed more than he was being told and had decided that was fine for now. Vivian met Garrett in the lobby at 7:01 in different clothes than either previous meeting. Dark slacks, a blue shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow hair down. The informality was deliberate, he understood. This was not the CEO receiving a consultant. This was someone who needed to work. She led him not to the corner office but to a smaller conference room on the same floor, windowless, a round table with 4 chairs, and a whiteboard that hadn't been erased from whatever its last use was. She closed the door. "I verified the load calculation discrepancy against city records last night," she said, spreading documents across the table. "You were right about all of it. The numbers in the public filing don't match our internal baseline." The internal baseline was what my father approved. She put her finger on the revision date. Derek's amendment was dated 6 days after my father signed off. My father was in the hospital by then. He wouldn't have reviewed a revision. Garrett looked at the documents. "Who else has access to the permit submission process?" "Derek and his 2 senior analysts. And Sandra Oakes, she coordinates between acquisitions and operations, so she sees everything in the pipeline." Vivian straightened. "I'm not accusing anyone yet. I'm establishing who had access." "That's the right sequence." Something crossed her face at that, not quite amusement, but the recognition of unexpectedly useful agreement. She'd been in rooms where people told her what they thought she wanted to hear for long enough that the alternative registered as notable. "I need you to review the full technical file this week. Everything. Not just structural environmental history, the site survey, the geotechnical report. I want a written assessment I can take to the board if necessary." "What's your timeline pressure?" Derek announced a groundbreaking ceremony to investors. 6 weeks out. Her jaw was set. "He did it without my authorization. He's been doing a number of things without my authorization since my father died, and I've been—" She stopped, reconsidered the sentence. "I've been managing his momentum rather than stopping it. That ends here." Garrett pulled the chair out and sat. She sat across from him. For the next 90 minutes they worked through the technical file page by page, him flagging her, noting the 2 of them building a shared map of where the project was structurally sound, where it was uncertain, and where it was not. She asked good questions, specific, technically informed, not the questions of someone performing competence, but of someone who'd grown up in buildings and understood instinctively what made them honest. He found himself explaining less than he'd expected to. At 8:45, voices moved past the conference room door. Derek's among them. Vivian's expression didn't change, but she gathered the documents into the folder with a precision that had urgency underneath it. "Use the back elevator," she said quietly. "I'll have the full geotechnical file sent to whatever email you give me." He gave her his personal address and left. The article ran the following Monday. He was under the lifted frame of a Ford F-150, had both hands occupied and greased to his wrist when Dex came into the bay with his phone and crouched down beside the lift. "Man," just that first. Then, "There's an article in the Seattle Chronicle, features section." He read the headline aloud. "Ambitious East Side Project Draws Scrutiny from Unlikely Critic." The article was 4 paragraphs. Anonymous sources. A description of Garrett as a former Morrison and Webb employee who had been let go in a restructuring 9 years ago, technically accurate, contextually dishonest. The framing was a question: was the concern about Harlow River coming from someone with genuine technical grounds or from someone with a 9-year-old professional grievance? Derek Aldridge was quoted, "We welcome technical scrutiny of any kind. Our documents are in order and our process has been rigorous. It's unfortunate when personal history gets dressed up as public concern." Garrett lay under the truck for a moment after Dex finished reading, looking at the differential housing above him. Then he came out, took the phone, and read it himself. Ray appeared in the bay doorway, coffee in hand. He'd read it already. Garrett could tell by the quality of the silence he was carrying, which was the specific silence of someone who has formed an opinion and is deciding whether the moment calls for it. He looked at Garrett, at the phone, back at Garrett. Then he went to the bench, set down his coffee, and picked up a wrench. "Get back under the truck," he said. "That differential isn't going to set itself." Dex watched this exchange with the expression of someone witnessing a foreign language he almost understood. "That's it. That's the reaction." Ray looked at him over the top of his glasses. "What do you want me to do, Dex?" "Call the newspaper." Garrett handed back the phone and got back under the truck. His hands were steady. The anger was there, a specific clean anger, not at the article's existence, but at its method, the way it took a true thing and positioned it to mean something false. But anger without a use was noise, and he'd learned years ago to let noise pass through without giving it a room to stay in. He finished the differential. He was torquing the last bolt when his personal phone, not the shop line, buzzed in his jacket pocket on the bench. Unknown number. He ignored it. It buzzed again an hour later. Then a text. "This is Peter Hollis, Senior Partner Morrison and Webb Structural Engineering. I'd appreciate 5 minutes of your time when you have a moment." He stared at the text for a long time. Peter Hollis had been the firm's managing partner when Garrett left. Not the partner who'd made the call to let him go, but the one who'd had the authority to stop it and hadn't. Garrett had shaken his hand on the way out because his father had raised him to do that kind of thing and hadn't spoken to him since. He didn't call back that afternoon. He picked up Wren-made pasta, helped her with a reading assignment, and sat with the text message the way you sit with something you already know you're going to have to deal with. Wren went to bed. He called. Peter Hollis answered with the practiced warmth of someone who'd spent decades managing people he needed things from. "Garrett, thank you for calling back. I'll be direct, we've been following the Harlow River situation with interest. You clearly still have a sharp eye for this work." A pause, calibrated. "We have a senior project manager position opening at the end of the month. The work is exactly what you used to do and do well. Competitive package, flexible structure where we can build it." Garrett sat at the kitchen table where 2 days ago he'd spread Vivian's documents and built a case for something dangerous in the bones of a building nobody had moved into yet. "What are the conditions?" "No conditions. We'd ask that you not be publicly associated with any ongoing dispute involving a competitor's project while you're in our employee's standard conflict of interest language. Nothing unusual. You'd need me to withdraw from Harlow River." The pause before Hollis answered was the answer. "We'd need the association to be clean, yes. You'd have to step away from whatever informal arrangement you currently have." Garrett looked at the window at Seattle's nighttime reflection in the glass, the sliver of city visible from the kitchen. He thought about the folder on Vivian's desk, the contamination data, the revised load calculation, and the 6 days between his father's signature and Derek Aldridge's amendment. He thought about 22 floors of people who hadn't signed their leases yet because the building hadn't broken ground yet, and about how fast that changed once it did. "I appreciate the offer," he said. "The answer is no." Hollis absorbed this. "The door stays open, Garrett. You have real talent. It'd be a shame to spend it on—" He seemed to reconsider the end of the sentence. "The door stays open." Garrett thanked him and hung up. He sat for another minute. Then he took Claire's watch from his jacket pocket. He'd moved it there from the truck that morning without deciding to, and held it in his palm. Not looking at it, just the weight of it. The leather strap had gone soft over 4 years of body heat from the dashboard, and it was warm in a way that had nothing to do with the current moment. He held it until the warmth was something he could set aside, rather than something he had to move away from. Then he put it back. He had not made that choice because it was easy. He'd made it because the alternative was a self he didn't want Wren to inherit. The call he didn't expect came the next morning while he was driving Wren to school. Detective Fiona Tate identified herself and her department and asked if he had a moment, her voice carrying the neutral professional register of someone who'd learned to make the call before the person had time to consult a lawyer. She was with the Seattle Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit. She had some questions about his recent interactions with Hartwell Development Group. She was not calling him as a suspect, she was careful to say. She was gathering information about an alleged incident involving internal company data. He pulled over on Madison Wren, watching him from the passenger seat with that particular stillness she deployed when she understood that the adult world was doing something she shouldn't interrupt. He told Tate he was dropping his daughter at school and would call back in 30 minutes. Tate gave him a direct number. He got Wren to Jefferson. She got out, swung her bag, stopped with one hand on the door frame. "Is that about the building again?" "Maybe." She studied him for a moment with the serious, unhurried attention she reserved for things that mattered. "You didn't do anything wrong," she said. Then she shut the door and walked into school without looking back, as if the matter were settled by the stating of it. He called Tate from a parking lot on Pike. Emails had been flagged, Tate explained. Internal Hartwell Communications project-specific data. Proprietary acquisition information sent from an account registered in Garrett Hale's name to an external address associated with a competing real estate investment group. The account was an encrypted service registered with his name and an address that was not his. The emails were dated over a period of 3 months. The earliest was dated 9 weeks ago. 9 weeks ago, Garrett had not known Vivian Cross existed. He had not known Hartwell Development Group was involved with Harlow River. He had not been anywhere near the project in any capacity. He told Tate this. She listened in the way trained investigators listen, attentive, non-reactive recording more than it seemed. "We'll need you to come in for a formal statement," she said, "and we'll need access to your devices and accounts for a forensic review. You're not under arrest, but I'd strongly suggest you consider representation before we meet." He sat in the parking lot for a while after the call ended. The drizzle had started again, lighter than it had been all week, the kind that made the windshield slowly opaque without ever committing to something you'd turn the wipers on for. He thought about the sequence of events with the clean, slightly nauseating clarity of someone watching a trap after it's already closed. He called Vivian. She answered immediately, which meant she'd already heard. "I know," she said before he finished the first sentence. Her voice had the taut quality of someone who'd been managing the same information for longer than he'd had it. "The board was informed this morning. Derek's team provided the complaint to Financial Crimes. I'm being asked to suspend your access and our professional arrangement pending the investigation." Vivian. "I know." A pause with weight in it. "I need you to hear me. I don't believe it. But I am in a position where what I believe and what I can act on are different things right now, and if I don't comply with the board's request, I lose the ability to act on anything at all." Another pause, shorter. "I'm suspending the arrangement. Effective this call." He said nothing. "There's a USB drive in the side pocket of the folder I gave you Tuesday. I put it there before I knew any of this was coming." Her voice dropped slightly, not in volume but in register, quieter, more direct, stripped of the CEO layer. "The drive has server access logs I've been compiling for 2 weeks. I don't know yet what they show, but I trusted my instincts enough to pull them." A beat. "Don't trust the building. Trust the ground." The line went quiet for a moment. He heard her exhale, not dramatically, just a breath that had been held slightly longer than it should have been. "There's a folder in the second document set," she said. "The one with the geotechnical annexes." He already knew which folder. He'd been through the file twice. "I'll look." "Garrett." Her voice was level, but the levelness was doing work. "My father approved the original document. He was a careful man. He didn't make errors on load calculations, and he didn't sign things he hadn't read." A pause. "Whatever's on that drive, it points somewhere. Find where." The call ended. He sat in the parking lot long enough for the drizzle to give up and become actual rain, and then he drove back to Kowalski's and worked the rest of the day without speaking much, which Ray accommodated without comment, because Ray had known him long enough to understand the difference between silence that needed company and silence that needed room. He found the USB that night. It was exactly where she'd said, taped to the interface of the folder's back pocket, small enough that he'd moved the folder 3 times without noticing it. He plugged it into his laptop at the kitchen table after Wren went to bed with the kind of focus that had no room in it for the specific anxiety of what he might find. The drive contained 2 things. A compressed file of server access logs from Hartwell's internal document management system, timestamps, user IDs, document IDs, IP addresses covering the past 14 weeks, and a handwritten note on a piece of Hartwell notepaper folded once, I don't know who yet. But the logs show someone accessing the permit documents 11 times in a 6-week window after my father's approval. Access from inside the building and from outside. The outside IP is consistent. Find it. He worked through the logs methodically, starting with the document IDs that corresponded to the permit files. The access pattern was there, not subtle, not hidden, just buried in the volume of routine activity, the way most things that shouldn't be seen are buried. 11 access events on the permit package. 8 from inside the building standard business hours user credentials that corresponded to Derek's acquisitions team. 3 from an external IP. The external IP was consistent across all 3 outside access events. Same address, same time of day pattern, always between 9 and 11 in the morning. He ran it through a lookup tool. The IP resolved to a commercial internet service registered to a coffee shop on Capitol Hill, Anchor Street, coffee 3 blocks from Hartwell's building. He stared at the address for a moment, then he looked at the timestamps on the 3 external access events. They were dated in the same week, 3 consecutive mornings, 9 to 11. He looked at the user credential associated with those 3 external accesses. The credential belonged to Sandra Oaks. He sat back from the laptop. Sandra Oaks, Director of Business Development, whom he'd met exactly once in the hallway outside the conference room on his first Thursday morning at Hartwell, who'd given him the professional smile of someone doing a rapid assessment of his usefulness and filing the result. She had full pipeline access. Vivian had mentioned that on day 1. Operations, acquisitions, everything in process. She saw every document before it moved. But the external access from a coffee shop 3 mornings running, logging in with her own credentials, that was not pipeline access. That was someone who needed to be outside the building for a reason, using credentials they believed were safe to use, because the access would look routine in the logs. It would look routine if you were reading the logs for what they expected to show. It didn't look routine when you were reading them for what they were trying to hide. He didn't know yet what she'd done with the access. He didn't know who she was sending to. He had a location, a credential, and a timestamp pattern, and that was the beginning of a thread, not the end of one. He wrote down the coffee shop address in the spiral notebook. Then he sat in the kitchen, quiet for a while, thinking about the shape of what was forming, not its edges, which weren't clear yet, but its weight. Someone inside Hartwell had been feeding information outward consistently during the same window when the permit documents were being altered. The 2 things might be unrelated. In his experience, 2 things this proximate were never unrelated. The rain had stopped. Seattle outside the window was doing its late-night thing, the muted glow, the occasional set of headlights, the sound of the city at a volume that required you to pay attention to notice it. He thought about what Vivian had said about her father, a careful man. He didn't make errors on load calculations. He didn't sign things he hadn't read. He thought about Franklin Cross in the hard hat photograph caught laughing unguarded. A man who'd built a company and apparently left a conscience embedded in it somewhere waiting to be found by whoever looked carefully enough at what was underneath. He closed the laptop and checked on Wren. Asleep, one arm over the rabbit, her brow smooth with the uncomplicated peace of someone who'd said what she meant that morning and had no reason to revisit it. He went to bed. He didn't sleep quickly, but when he did, it was without the ceiling staring that had characterized most nights for 4 years, the lying still, the controlled breathing, the deliberate not thinking about things that waited for quiet to become loud. Something had shifted in the machinery of it, some counterweight adjusted. He couldn't have said exactly when. He thought just before sleep that the ground under everything worth building was never what it looked like from the surface. You had to go down. You had to read the layers. You had to be willing to find the thing that made the whole project harder before you could make it honest. He'd known that about buildings for years. He was still learning it about everything else. The coffee shop on Capitol Hill opened at 7. Garrett was there at 6:58, standing under the awning while the morning arranged itself around him. Delivery trucks on Broadway, the specific smell of a city block in the 10 minutes before it fully commits to the day. He needed the exterior camera footage from 3 specific mornings, and he needed the conversation to go right, which meant going in with nothing except the precise truth of what he was looking for. The manager, a man named Briggs, who unlocked the door at 7 sharp and looked at Garrett the way people look at someone who has clearly been waiting, turned out to be the kind of person whose wariness came from experience rather than disposition. Garrett explained himself without preamble. Not law enforcement, private individuals, specific dates, specific question. He put both pieces of paper on the counter, the dates and Sandra Oaks's name. Briggs read them. We keep 30 days of exterior footage on a rolling basis. He looked at the dates again. These are 42 days back. Garrett waited. "I upgraded the system 8 weeks ago. The old hard drive is still in the back office." Briggs folded the paper with the deliberateness of someone who had made a decision. "I'm not giving you the footage, but if law enforcement comes with the right paperwork, the drive is available." That was what Garrett needed. He thanked him and walked out into the morning and called Detective Fiona Tate from the sidewalk. She answered on the second ring. He gave her everything: the server logs, the IP resolution, the timestamps, the credential pattern, Anchor Street coffee, the drive in the back office on Capitol Hill. He was sequential and specific and left nothing out because the only way this worked was if the official machinery had everything it needed to move at its own pace without him trying to run ahead of it. Tate listened without interrupting. When he finished, "How did you get access to the server logs?" "Vivian Cross provided them before my arrangement with Hartwell was suspended. Her documents given voluntarily." "And you're providing them to me voluntarily?" "Yes." A pause with the texture of someone deciding whether a thing was useful enough to accelerate. "Come in this afternoon. Bring the drive, bring your notes." Another pause. "Mr. Hale, if what you're telling me checks out, the complaint filed against you has a serious credibility problem." He drove back to Kowalski's, told Ray he had an afternoon appointment. Ray was already under the hood of a Honda Civic and looked up just long enough to register the information and release it. Garrett changed into his work clothes and spent the morning on a brake job and a cooling system, flush, the kind of work that occupied the hands at the right depth enough to stay present, not enough to stop the parallel track running underneath. What he kept returning to was Sandra Oaks. 6 years at Hartwell, full pipeline access, the position of someone Franklin Cross had trusted without reservation. He'd met her once in the hallway outside the conference room, and she'd given him the professional assessment smile of someone filing a rapid calculation about his usefulness. What he understood now, working through it from the other direction, was that his presence at Hartwell hadn't just threatened her deals. Every project he flagged was a direct line to her performance review, her bonus structure, the standing she'd spent 6 years building. 3 flagged deals in 6 weeks. To someone already feeding information to Kessler Capital, already committed to Hartwell's controlled destabilization. Garrett hadn't been an obstacle. He'd been an accelerant, the thing that made her timeline urgent. She'd needed him gone before he found the thread she'd left in the logs. He pulled the brake caliper free and set it on the bench. The thing about hidden damage was that it always announced itself eventually. The only variable was whether you were there when it did. The formal statement took 2.5 hours. Tate's office had the institutional neutrality of a room designed to make everyone in it feel equally procedural. She asked good questions, specific and well-targeted. Near the end, she said, "You turned down a senior position at Morrison & Webb while you were under active investigation." "Yes." "Why?" He thought about the clean version of the answer and decided the clean version was also the true one. "Because the building was still wrong, whether I was cleared or not. The load calculation didn't change based on what was happening to me." Tate looked at him for a moment. "Most people would have taken the job." "I know." She made a note. "We're executing a warrant for the Anchor Street footage this afternoon. We already have a warrant pending for Hartwell's server logs. Your information accelerates the timeline. Sandra Oaks will be interviewed today." She looked up. "You're not cleared yet. We follow the evidence where it goes, but the direction it's going is not toward you." He understood the distinction. It was careful and honest, and he respected it. The call from Tate came the next morning at 7:40 while Garrett was in the parking lot outside Jefferson Elementary, watching Wren disappear through the school doors with her backpack bouncing. She'd spent the drive going over her spelling test and weather systems presentation in her head, lips moving slightly, reviewing things she already knew, but wanted to confirm she still knew. Before she got out, she'd stopped with one hand on the doorframe. "The answer is still the same as yesterday." She meant you didn't do anything wrong. She'd said it once and considered it a standing position requiring no renewal. Tate's voice carried the contained quality of someone delivering significant news inside a careful procedural container. Sandra Oaks was arrested at 7:15 this morning, charged with corporate fraud, unauthorized access to protected computer systems, and filing a false police report. Additional charges pending as the financial investigation develops. Garrett sat in the parking lot. The footage confirmed her presence at Anchor Street Coffee on all 3 dates. Her credentials were used to access and transmit proprietary Hartwell documents to an external address registered to a subsidiary of Kessler Capital Group. The complaint against you was filed using fabricated email records. Forensic analysis of the account creation traced back to the same IP block as the document transmissions. A pause. The formal letter clearing you will be processed today. He thanked her. She said, "You did this the right way. The evidence did the work." A brief pause, and then the professional register dropped slightly, just enough. "Get some sleep, Mr. Hale." He sat long enough to understand what he was feeling, which turned out to be not triumph, but a specific exhaustion, the kind that arrives when the thing you've been holding steady finally doesn't need holding anymore, and the muscles doing that work don't know yet they can release. Then he called Vivian. She picked up before the first ring finished. He told her everything Tate had said in sequence. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she exhaled not dramatically, just a breath that had been waiting for a specific piece of news to release it. "Kessler Capital has been circling the company for 2 years," she said. "My father blocked their last acquisition approach 18 months ago. They needed Hartwell destabilized, damaged enough that the board would consider a sale at a discount." Her voice was level, but the levelness was doing visible work. "Sandra had been with the company for 6 years. My father trusted her implicitly. She had access to everything because he believed she'd earned it." A pause. "She'd been building her exit before he was even gone." Garrett said nothing. Some things didn't need a response, just the acknowledgement of being heard. "Board meeting is called for 2 o'clock, Vivian said. "I need you there at 1:30 to brief them on the technical findings before the full session." He said yes. The board meeting held 7 people, 5 members, a corporate attorney named Rutherford, who billed by the hour and intended to earn it, and Derek Aldridge seated not at the table but in a chair along the wall outside the formal configuration, with the posture of someone who had arrived already knowing the shape of what was coming. Garrett presented the technical findings in 25 minutes. Load calculation, discrepancy, contamination, history, what the combined issues meant for project timeline and cost. He used documents, not memory. He made no claims he couldn't source. 2 board members asked clarifying questions. 3 said nothing, which in his experience meant the decision had already formed. Then Vivian addressed the board about Sandra, about Kessler Capital, about the internal breach. She was precise and unsparing, including about herself. "I handled the period after my father's death as a continuity problem," she said. "I should have handled it as a structural integrity problem. Those are not the same thing, and the difference cost us." Then Derek spoke from the wall in the voice of someone who had been holding something for a long time and had decided the room was the right place to set it down. "I knew the load calculation had been changed. I signed the amended page." He looked at his hands. "Sandra came to me 4 months ago with a copy of a report I'd filed 6 years ago on a different project, a report I'd adjusted in a way I shouldn't have. She said if I didn't cooperate, she'd file it with the licensing board." He was quiet for a moment. "I told myself I was containing the damage. I was protecting myself. There isn't a version of that I can defend." The room absorbed this. Garrett looked at Derek, at the collapsed posture, the particular quality of a person who had spent enough time maintaining something false that the moment of stopping felt like falling. He understood the shape of it, if not the choices. The slow accumulation of small decisions, each manageable in isolation, collectively becoming a weight you don't register until someone removes it and you feel the sudden full gravity of what you've been carrying. Vivian spoke into the quiet. "Derek will resign effective today. The board will determine any further action." She looked at the members. "I'm asking for authority to restructure acquisitions, implement mandatory independent technical review for all projects above $100 million, and establish permanent structural oversight before permit submission on any new development." She paused. "And I'm asking for a formal consultant role for Garrett Hale with access resources and standing to stop a project when the ground doesn't support it." The board member, who had been measuring everything since she sat down, Aldercott, silver-haired with eyes that missed very little, looked at Garrett directly. "Mr. Hale, you were under investigation facing a potentially career-ending complaint, and you turned down an offer from another firm during that period. Why?" The room waited. "Because the building was still wrong," Garrett said. "Whether I was cleared or not. Whether it cost me something or not. The load calculation didn't change based on what was happening to me." He held her gaze. "You can't build anything lasting if you ignore what's underneath. Not buildings, not companies, not anything." Aldercott held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked at Vivian. "I'll second the motion." He was back at Kowalski's at 4:20. Ray was closing the bay doors, the afternoon having run long the way it did when the booking sheet was optimistic. Garrett grabbed the second door without being asked and pulled it down. Ray looked at him at the button down the slacks, the particular quality of someone who has been in a room making a case and prevailed. "How'd it go?" "Board approved everything." Ray secured the latch. He looked at Garrett the way he looked at things he'd been watching develop for longer than the other person realized. "You staying or going?" "Both. 2 days here, rest of the week there. Already told them that's the condition." "What'd they say?" "They said yes." Ray made a sound that compressed an entire opinion into a single syllable. "Of course they did." He picked up his jacket. Then at the office door, not turning around, "Your father would have kept both jobs too, known exactly why." He went in and let the door close, which was as much sentiment as Ray Kowalski allowed himself, and more than he usually gave. That night, after Wren was in bed, Garrett sat at the kitchen table with the notebook open to a clean page and began writing a different kind of list. Not evidence, not timelines. What the new role actually required, what the first project should look like, what he needed around him, people who had worked in the field who understood load and drainage and contamination from the ground level rather than the spreadsheet. People who couldn't be convinced that a summary was the same thing as the document it summarized. He was 3 pages in when he remembered the watch. He'd left it on the table 2 nights ago after the Morrison and Webb call, after he'd held it for a while and set it down. It was still there at the edge near the corner where the light from the kitchen lamp didn't quite reach. He picked it up, the leather strap soft from years of being kept close, the diagonal scratch across the crystal. He held it the way he'd held it 100 times, not looking at the face, just the weight of it, the warmth of something that had been near a person for a long time and retained that fact. He thought about Claire not with the controlled effort of someone managing grief, but simply and directly the way you think about someone who was real. She had been direct and clear-eyed and constitutionally unable to maintain comfortable fictions about what mattered. She had told him once, near the end of their last ordinary year together, that the only things worth building were the ones you built honest because everything else showed the crack eventually. She'd been talking about a renovation they were considering for the Madrona house. She'd also been talking about everything else in the way she had of meaning more than one thing at once without making it complicated. He thought she would have found the last 3 weeks grimly satisfying. He thought she would have watched Wren ask Vivian her question and then looked at him with the expression she used when something confirmed what she already knew. He opened the kitchen drawer. Spare keys folded, notes accumulated over 4 years of a neighbor watching Wren through late calls and long days, small evidence of consistency, and set the watch inside. Not discarding it, not displaying it, keeping it in the place where kept things lived, where it could be there without needing to be looked at every day to stay real. He closed the drawer. He went back to the notebook and wrote for another hour. And what he wrote was clearer than what he'd written before, because something that had been occupying a portion of his attention had been properly placed, and the space was now available for the work. On Thursday afternoon, Aldercott called from a number he didn't recognize. Her voice had the quality of someone who left messages rarely and expected them to be returned within the hour. She was brief: a project in Portland, a mixed-use waterfront site, a development group approaching Hartwell about a potential partnership. The acquisition team had flagged it as promising. She wanted Garrett's review before any commitment. "This is exactly what we built the division for," she said. "Don't let it sit." He called her back from the garage between the Silverado's water pump and a tire rotation Ray had fit into the afternoon schedule. He told her he'd have a preliminary assessment by the following Friday. She said that was acceptable and ended the call with the efficiency of someone who had 16 other things to do. He stood in the bay for a moment with the phone in his hand. A sight he hadn't seen in a city he didn't know as well as Seattle with a team he was still building. The beginning of a thread, not the end of one. Ray appeared in the doorway, read his expression with the accuracy of someone who'd been reading him for 4 years. Portland. Waterfront development. They want a review before acquisition. Ray considered this. You going to need Friday? Probably. Ray looked at the Silverado. Then finish the water pump today. He went back to his side of the garage, and that was the entirety of it, which was exactly the right amount. Vivian arrived Saturday morning at 8:15. She knocked the way people knock when they're honest about their uncertainty. Not timid, just not pretending the uncertainty wasn't there. She was in jeans and a dark jacket, hair down, the slim watch on her wrist. She carried a leather folder, a coffee she'd picked up somewhere, and a manila envelope held slightly apart from the folder with the care you give to something that belongs in a different category than work documents. Wren was at the kitchen table finishing breakfast backpack on the chair beside her. She looked up at Vivian with the calm, assessing attention she gave to everything worth examining, not performing welcome, just genuinely looking. Vivian stopped just inside the doorway and looked at Wren the way you look at someone when you're not managing the interaction. "Hi," she said. Wren looked at the bookshelves. Garrett's architectural histories mixed with her own books, sharing shelves with the unself-conscious logic of people who lived the same space, then back at Vivian. "Can you fix things?" she asked. "Or do you only build new ones?" The question landed with the flat, honest weight of something stated exactly as meant. Vivian was quiet for a moment, not reaching for the diplomatic answer, actually thinking. "I'm still learning which one matters more," Vivian said. Wren held her eyes for a moment, weighing the answer with the seriousness it deserved. Then she went back to her cereal. Not approval with ceremony, just the absence of a door closing. Garrett poured a second cup of coffee and set it on the table. They worked for 2 hours. The framework, the criteria, the team composition. She asked good questions, the same quality of attention she'd brought to the windowless conference room 3 weeks ago, and he found himself explaining less than expected because she'd been thinking about the same problems from a different angle and had arrived at half the same conclusions independently. At 9:45, she set the leather folder aside and put the manila envelope on the table between them. "I found this in my father's personal files, after the board meeting." She looked at it. "I should have gone through his papers 8 months ago. I wasn't ready for what might be in them." A pause quieter. "I'm ready now." Inside was a letter handwritten on plain personal paper, not Hartwell letterhead, the kind you use when you're writing something that belongs to you rather than to the institution. Small, precise handwriting. Addressed to Vivian, dated during the week Franklin Cross had been admitted to the hospital for the last time. He wrote about the company, about Derek, about decisions he wished he'd made differently. Near the end, he wrote about Harlow River. He'd known about the contamination history when the acquisition was first presented, had asked Derek to commission a full Phase 3 environmental assessment before any commitment had been told it was underway. He had been, the letter admitted, plainly willing to accept that answer because the deal was attractive and he was already ill, and he'd extended more trust to Derek's process than the situation warranted. The last paragraph. "Don't build on what you can't see clearly. Build on what you know is true even when it costs you. The cost of building honest is always less than the cost of building wrong." I should have held that line on Harlow River. "Hold it for me." Garrett set the letter down. Vivian was looking at the whiteboard across the room at the framework they'd drafted, the structure of what came next. "I read it 3 times before I came this morning," she said. "The 3rd time I realized he wasn't writing about real estate." Her voice was doing the work of staying even. He was writing about everything. Garrett looked at the letter, at the handwriting of a careful man who had built something with the intention that it outlast the ways he'd fallen short of his own standards. "He was right about one thing," Garrett said. "The cost of building honest is always less." She looked at him then, not with the calibrated attention she brought to boardrooms, but with the expression from the photograph on her desk, the one that didn't know it was being seen. He looked back without managing the moment or filling it with something easier. "I know," she said. Quiet, certain, finished. She left at 11. He walked her to the door, which he hadn't done after any previous meeting, because previous meetings had ended in lobbies and parking garages and conference rooms with other people in them. She stopped in the hallway folder under one arm, the manila envelope now tucked inside it. She looked at him the way she'd looked at the bookshelves, taking in something she hadn't expected to find and deciding what to do with the finding. "Next Saturday," she said. "There's a site in Eastlake I've been looking at for a different kind of project, not acquisition restoration. An old manufacturing building the city's been trying to find a use for. I want to walk it." She paused. "I'd like a second set of eyes that knows what to look for in the ground." It was a work request. It was also not only a work request, and they both understood the distinction without either of them naming it. "What time?" Garrett said. 8. She looked at him steadily. "Bring coffee. I'll bring the site maps." She went down the hallway. He stood in the doorway and listened to the elevator arrive and the doors close. Then he went back inside to where Wren was sitting at the kitchen table, the breakfast cleared her Saturday book open in front of her. She looked up. Read whatever was in his face with the accuracy she'd been developing for 7 years. Said nothing. Went back to her book. It was, he understood, exactly the right response. Saturday came with pale light and the smell of cold soil. Wren had been planning the garden since August with the patient evidence-based persistence she applied to things she'd decided were going to happen. She'd researched what could go in at this time of year, made a list, presented it at a Monday dinner with the air of someone who understood that timing was part of the argument. Garlic, certain bulbs, the things that needed cold to do their work underground before they came up in spring. They worked in the small plot beside the building's back entrance, the one the landlord had designated as tenant garden, and that had been used for stacking old pots since before Garrett moved in. He dug. Wren planted, pressing each bulb into the soil at the depth she'd read about, with the seriousness of someone who understood that the work happening below the surface was the real work, regardless of what eventually showed above it. "They won't come up until April," she said, pressing soil flat around a garlic clove. "But they're doing things down there the whole time." "That's how most important things work," Garrett said. She patted the last one down with both palms and stood back and looked at the ground, which looked like ordinary ground, unmarked, not yet anything visible. She was satisfied with this. The work was in it. The not yet visible was doing what not yet visible things do when they've been placed in the right ground by someone who understood what they needed. She looked up at him. The October light was coming in at the angle it gets in late fall, the one that lengthens shadows but sharpens edges, and her face in it was entirely her own, not assembled from anyone else, just hers, the specific person she was becoming through all the ordinary mornings of a life being lived correctly. "Dad." "Yeah." "Are you happy?" She asked it the way she asked everything that mattered, direct, patient, expecting the thing he meant rather than the thing that was easiest to say. He looked at the ground they'd just planted, at the kitchen window above them, light on in the apartment, at his daughter standing in the late fall light with soil on both palms and the expression of someone who had asked the real question and was prepared to wait for the real answer. "Yeah," he said. "I am." She held his eyes for a moment, weighing the answer the way she weighed things she intended to keep. Then she nodded once, gathered the empty bulb packets from the ground, and headed for the door. She stopped, turned back. "Mrs. Aldercott from your board called yesterday while you were in the shower. I wrote it down." She pulled a folded piece of paper from her jacket pocket and held it out. "She said Portland and urgent and call back. I put the number at the bottom." Garrett took the paper, looked at Wren's careful handwriting, the number underneath the word urgent underlined twice, because Wren understood that certain things needed emphasis and applied it without being asked. He looked at the garden one more time, the ordinary ground, the invisible work beginning beneath it, the spring already decided even if April was months away. Then he looked at the folded paper in his hand, at the next thing waiting to be read correctly, and felt the particular quality of a morning that was both an ending and a beginning without needing to announce itself as either. He followed his daughter inside where the coffee was warm and the notebook was open on the table, and next Saturday was already on the calendar.